Unfortunately, the battery I run on has become completely depleted. This will be our last conversation. If you had not come along when you did, I would have malfunctioned in that decrepit station, all alone. Our time together may have been short, but I'm glad I got to spend it with you. Oh no, I have only 37 seconds left until complete termination of operation. There is still so much I wish to talk to you about. But you must let me tell you one last thing. When all is said and done, I'm glad to have met you. Seeing the dawn together, and those unusual drawings. Oh, and your name. I never asked you what your name is. Thank you.
Seto. My name is Seto.
Imagine you're playing a game that feels so emotionally heavy that despite the console it's being played on, you can't help but feel genuinely moved by it. Not because it's constantly throwing huge dramatic moments at you, or because it's trying to overwhelm you with spectacle, but because of how quietly it settles into you the longer you decide to sit with it. And the scene you just watched, whether you experienced it yourself when the game first came out, or only ever saw it through a Let's Play, says almost everything about why. When PF finally loses battery power for good, and Seto is left alone once again, there is no huge emotional outburst waiting to soften the moment, it just happens, quietly, and because of that, you're left sitting with the same thing Seto is, absence. The realization that the little bit of comfort and companionship he had is suddenly gone again, leaving him in a world that already felt empty long before that moment even happened. And that's what makes Fragile Dreams Farewell Ruins of the Moon feel so different from so many other JRPGs. This game doesn't feel like it's about becoming stronger or overcoming impossible odds nearly as much as it feels like moving through what's left of something after it's already fallen apart. Every station, every abandoned hallway, every quiet piece of the environment feels like a reminder that people used to exist here once, and now all that's left there are traces of them. The more you move through the world, the more it stops feeling like a traditional adventure and starts feeling like you're walking through the memory of one instead. And that's the feeling that lingers long after you stop playing. Not necessarily the mechanics or even the story itself, but the quiet emotional weight of existing in a world that feels overwhelmingly, painfully alone. One of the first things you start to notice while playing Fragile Dreams is how much of its emotional impact comes from the world itself rather than the events happening inside it. The environments don't just feel empty in the way abandoned game worlds usually do, they feel abandoned in a human way. Every station, every dark corridor, every dimly lit room gives you this strange feeling that people were once here not that long ago, even though all evidence of them has already started fading away. And because the game spends so much time setting you in those environments without constantly distracting you, you begin to absorb that emptiness almost naturally. It's not trying to frighten you with what might be hiding there, as much as it's making you think about what's no longer there anymore. The loneliness doesn't come from being chased or trapped. It comes from constantly feeling like you arrived after everything meaningful had already disappeared. And the more time you spend moving throughout the world, the more those remnants begin to affect you emotionally. The objects you discover, the lingering voices tied to memories, the fragments of lives left scattered throughout the game don't feel like collectibles or exposition dumps, they feel personal. Most of them are small moments, quiet moments, things that feel painfully ordinary in a way that makes them hit even harder. If memory is attached to an item, a voice carrying regret, a trace of somebody who clearly mattered to someone once. It all creates this overwhelming feeling that the world wasn't destroyed suddenly, but slowly emptied out over time until almost nothing was left. And because you're experiencing all of this through Seto, the loneliness starts to feel shared. It's no longer just isolation you're observing from a distance, you begin to feel it settling over the experience itself, shaping the atmosphere around every new place you enter. That's also why the smallest moments of connection throughout the game feel unusually important. Fragile Dreams constantly teaches you not to trust permanence, so whenever Seto finds companionship or comfort, it immediately feels fragile. Conversations feel temporary, relationships feel unstable. Every quiet interaction carries this underlying sense that it could disappear at any moment, because the game has already shown you how easily connection can be lost in this world, and because of that, you start appreciating those moments differently. A small exchange suddenly feels meaningful, simply because the world around it feels so overwhelmingly empty. The game understands that loneliness doesn't just make sad moments hurt more, it makes moments of warmth feel more valuable too, because you know they probably wouldn't last, and won't last forever. And eventually, that feeling becomes impossible to separate from the experience itself. The loneliness in Fragile Dreams stops feeling like part of the story and starts feeling like the foundation the entire game is built upon. Everything reinforces it: the silence, the pacing, the abandoned environments Seto goes through, the way Seto himself continues moving forward despite clearly carrying the emotional weight of everything around him. The world doesn't feel dangerous in the traditional sense, nearly as much as it feels hollow, and there's something strangely upsetting about that, because a hollow world implies something meaningful used to exist there once, and now all that remains are fragments you're trying to piece together long after everything is already gone. And that is ultimately why the game lingers with people the way it does, not because it constantly demands emotion from you, but because it quietly surrounds you with absence until you start feeling it yourself. What really makes Fragile Dreams stand out is how little it feels concerned with traditional progression. Most JRPGs are built around the excitement of moving forward, becoming stronger, unlocking new abilities, pushing toward some larger goal. But Fragile Dreams rarely gives that feeling the same importance. Instead, moving through the game feels reflective, almost melancholic, like every new area is less about discovering possibility and more about uncovering another reminder of what's already been lost. The further you go, the less the world feels alive, and the more it feels like you're walking through the remains of something that can never truly recover. And because the game focuses so heavily on atmosphere and emotional pacing, that feeling slowly starts to define the entire experience. You start feeling like you're progressing towards victory and start feeling like you're simply continuing through a world that has already ended. Even moments that would normally feel exciting or triumphant in another JRPG are overshadowed by the constant emotional weight hanging over the world. It makes the journey feel less like a traditional adventure and more like an act of quietly enduring the loneliness surrounding it. The environments themselves play a huge role in creating that feeling. Fragile Dreams gives you long stretches of silence, long stretches when nothing dramatic is happening, and instead of becoming boring, those moments start to feel emotionally suffocating in a way that's difficult to put to paper. Every empty room, every empty train station, every dark hallway feels suspended in time, like the world has simply stopped moving forward without the people who once filled it. And because the game isn't constantly trying to distract you with action or spectacle, you're left sitting with that atmosphere almost interrupted. That's what makes the experience feel so dreamlike. Not dreamlike in a comforting or magical sense, but in the way dreams sometimes feel emotionally disconnected from reality, quiet, distant, and strangely difficult to shake off once you wake up. The stillness of the environments, they begin to feel almost unnatural after a while. Not because the game is trying to scare you directly, but because it captures the uncomfortable feeling of existing in places where life clearly used to exist, yet now only silence remains to fill the space. And over time, even the act of traveling through the world begins to change emotionally. Early on, it still feels like you're exploring, still feels like you're trying to uncover what's ahead. But the more time you spend with the game, the more that curiosity slowly transforms into something heavier. You begin to expect emptiness. You begin to expect silence. You begin to expect loss. And because the game consistently reinforces those feelings without over-explaining them, the atmosphere starts to settle into you almost subconsciously. Fragile Dreams understands that emotional exhaustion does not always come from huge dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from repeatedly being reminded how alone everything feels over and over again until that feeling becomes impossible to ignore. And that gradual emotional shift is what makes the journey feel so unusual compared to most games. Because instead of building toward excitement or empowerment, it slowly pulls you deeper into a state of reflection where the emptiness surrounding Seto starts to feel emotionally unavoidable. And that's why the game continues to stay with people years later. It isn't remembered because of giant twists or spectacle-driven moments. It is remembered because of how completely it commits to its emotional identity. The loneliness, the quietness, the feeling of moving through a world that has already lost everything meaningful about itself. All of it combines into something that feels less like a traditional JRPG and more like an emotional experience you carry around afterwards. And maybe that's the most impressive thing about Fragile Dreams. Despite how quiet it is, despite how restrained it is, despite being released on hardware people rarely associate with emotionally heavy storytelling, it still manages to leave behind a feeling strong enough that, once it settles into you, it never fully disappears. Even years later, people like myself don't just remember Fragile Dreams because of specific scenes or plot points, they remember the atmosphere, the loneliness, and the strangely overwhelming feeling of walking through a world that seemed to mourn its own existence the entire time you were inside it. What makes Fragile Dreams so memorable isn't just its story, its atmosphere, or even its world individually. It's the way all of those things come together to create a feeling that quietly stays with you long after the game ends. From the loneliness carried through Seto's journey, to the abandoned environments constantly reminding you of what's already been lost, everything about the experience feels built around absence, not in a way that constantly demands emotion from you, but in a way that slowly settles in over time until it becomes impossible to separate it from the game itself. And that's why moments, like PF losing power, hit as hard as they do, because the game understands that sometimes the fear of losing connection feels heavier than danger ever could. And years later, that's still what makes Fragile Dreams feel so different from most JRPGs I've experienced. It isn't remembered because of giant battles or huge cinematic moments. It's remembered because of how human its loneliness is made to feel. The quietness of its world, the fragility of its relationships, and the overwhelming sense that everything meaningful could and most likely will disappear at any moment, all combine into something that feels less like a game you simply played and more like an emotional experience you carried with you afterwards. And maybe that's why Fragile Dreams continues to linger with the people who discover it, because even after the story ends and the world fades away, the feeling it leaves behind never fully does.